My wife texted at 2 a.m. Friday night. Something came up at work. Relax, I'll explain, Sue. I said, no need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now. 20 minutes later, she was frantically ringing the doorbell in tears. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was some kind of insomniac workaholic who thrived on 3 hours of sleep and motivational podcasts. The truth is, I was lying in bed at 2:03 a.m. on a Friday night, staring at my ceiling like it owed me money, trying desperately to memorize a presentation that my boss would probably tear apart anyway, because Greg from accounting always had one more suggestion that derailed the entire meeting. Work had been absolutely brutal that week. The kind of brutal where you start questioning if a paycheck is really worth slowly dying inside a beige cubicle under fluorescent lights that made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie. So yeah, I wasn't asleep. I was just lying there in the dark, rehearsing bullet points in my head and wondering if anyone had ever actually died from PowerPoint-induced stress. That's when my phone decided to ruin what was left of my already garbage evening. The screen lit up like a tiny nuclear explosion on my nightstand, and I squinted at it with the enthusiasm of a man who knew nothing good ever came from notifications after midnight. It was a text from Clara, my wife of 8 years, the woman who color-coded our grocery lists and sent passive-aggressive calendar invites for quality time, like we were business associates scheduling a merger. The message read, something came up at work. Relax, I'll explain, Sue. I had to read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because my brain physically rejected what it was seeing. Sue? Clara, the woman who once spent 20 minutes debating whether to use an Oxford comma in a birthday card, had just sent me a text with a typo. Clara, who corrected my grammar during arguments like she was grading a term paper, who literally had autocorrect on her autocorrect, had just casually thrown out Sue, like she was some teenager texting during math class. This was a woman who treated the English language like a sacred temple, and here she was, desecrating it at 2 in the morning with a 00 abomination. A typo from Clara wasn't just unusual. It was like watching a priest walk into a casino, sit down at the blackjack table, and ask the dealer if they accepted prayer as currency. Something was off. Way off. And I didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out what it was. Clara was supposed to be at a work dinner tonight, which apparently had now evolved into an after-hours situation that required staying out past midnight with her married boss, Richard, a guy who wore too much cologne and laughed at his own jokes like he was auditioning for a sitcom that nobody wanted to watch. She'd mentioned this dinner exactly 3 times over the past week, each time with a weird emphasis on how important and mandatory it was, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. And now here we were, in the dead of night, with her sending me typo-riddled damage control messages from God knows where. I sat up in bed, my heart doing that annoying thing where it speeds up, but you're trying to stay calm, because losing your cool at 2 a.m. feels dramatic even when it's completely justified. I stared at that message for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 30 seconds, watching the little typing dots appear and disappear like she was over there crafting the perfect follow-up lie. Part of me wanted to call her immediately and demand answers, but another part of me, the smarter, more petty part, knew exactly what to do. I opened the message thread, positioned my thumbs over the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon about to perform life-saving surgery, and typed out the most calm, collected, absolutely devastating response I could muster. No need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now. I read it once, twice, 3 times. Perfect. No emojis, no exclamation points, no angry misspellings that she could later use to paint me as the unhinged one. Just pure, concentrated peace wrapped in a single sentence that basically nuked 8 years of marriage in 26 characters. My finger hovered over the send button for maybe half a second before I thought, screw it, and pressed down like I was launching missiles. The message swooshed away into the digital void, and I felt this weird sense of calm wash over me. The kind of calm you feel when you finally make a decision you've been avoiding for way too long. And just like that, exactly 3 seconds after that message delivered, my phone started buzzing like it had been possessed by a swarm of angry bees auditioning for a horror movie. Call after call, text after text, the notifications rolling in so fast that my screen looked like a slot machine that just hit jackpot. I could see her name flashing over and over. Clara, Clara, Clara. Each call more desperate than the last, probably accompanied by whatever panicked explanation she'd frantically cobbled together in the parking lot of wherever she actually was. But here's the thing about finally reaching your limit with someone. You stop caring about their panic. You stop feeling obligated to answer just because they suddenly realize they screwed up. If Clara could stay out until 2 a.m. doing whatever sketchy nonsense she was doing, then she could stay out permanently as far as I was concerned. I reached over, picked up my phone with all the enthusiasm of someone picking up a piece of junk mail, and did something I'd been wanting to do for weeks without realizing it. I flipped it face down on the nightstand and rolled over. The buzzing continued, muffled now against the wood surface, sounding like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Call declined. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Call declined. It was almost rhythmic, almost soothing in a weird way, like the universe's most annoying white noise machine. Each ignored call felt like a tiny victory, a small reclamation of my dignity that had been slowly eroding over the past few months while I pretended not to notice Clara's increasingly suspicious behavior. I lay there in the dark, listening to my phone have a full-blown meltdown on my behalf, and realized something that probably should have occurred to me way earlier. I felt relieved. Not angry, not heartbroken, not even particularly surprised, just relieved. Relieved that I finally had a reason to stop pretending everything was fine. Relieved that I didn't have to keep making excuses for why my wife was suddenly working late 3 times a week. Relieved that I could finally stop lying to myself about what was clearly happening. The signs had been there for weeks, maybe even months. The new wardrobe full of clothes that were way too fancy for selling office furniture. The sudden interest in going to the gym at weird hours. The way she'd started angling her phone away from me when she texted, like I was some kind of corporate spy trying to steal classified information. My phone finally stopped buzzing around the 15th or 20th call. I'd honestly lost count, and the silence that followed was genuinely beautiful. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling more relaxed than I had in months, and thought about how wild it was that my entire marriage had basically ended via text message at 2 a.m. on a random Friday. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, no throwing dishes, or whatever people do in movies when relationships implode. Just a simple text message, a typo that gave away the game, and a calm response that sealed the deal. Honestly, it was almost poetic in its efficiency. As I finally started drifting off to sleep around 2:30, my last conscious thought was wondering how long it would take Clara to show up at the house, because there was absolutely no way she was going to accept that text message as the final word. I gave it maybe 20 minutes before I heard her car in the driveway, maybe 30 before she started banging on the door like the house was on fire. And you know what? I was absolutely right. But that's a problem for future Henry to deal with. Present Henry was going to enjoy this peaceful moment and maybe, just maybe, get a decent night's sleep for the first time in forever. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of impressed with my own prediction skills because exactly 22 minutes after I sent that text. Yes, I checked the time because I'm petty like that. I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching into our driveway like someone was auditioning for Fast and Furious, Suburban Meltdown Edition. The car door slammed with enough force to probably wake up everyone within a 3-block radius. And then came the frantic knocking that sounded less like knocking and more like someone trying to break through a door during a zombie apocalypse. But Clara wasn't satisfied with just the knocking. Oh no, that would be too subtle for the panic she was currently experiencing. She went straight for the doorbell. And I mean she went for it like it was a game show buzzer and the grand prize was saving her marriage. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. The doorbell was going off so repeatedly and aggressively that it stopped sounding like a doorbell and started sounding like a fire alarm having an existential crisis. I could picture her out there, finger glued to that button, probably crying, definitely panicking, absolutely losing whatever composure she thought she'd maintained during her little after-hours adventure with Richard the Boss Man. Part of me wondered if she'd eventually just break the doorbell entirely, and honestly, I wouldn't have been that upset about it because that thing was annoying even under normal circumstances. But here's the thing about being the one with the upper hand in a situation like this. You get to control the pace. You get to decide when and how things happen. So instead of rushing to the door like some desperate fool who was ready to accept whatever half-baked excuse she'd cooked up during her drive home, I decided to take my sweet time. I got out of bed with all the urgency of a sloth on vacation, stretched a little bit because my back had been killing me from that terrible office chair I'd been complaining about for months, and shuffled into the bathroom like it was just another regular night and not the dramatic implosion of my marriage. I brushed my teeth. Thoroughly. Like, I'm talking a full 2 minutes of brushing, the way dentists always tell you to do, but nobody actually does, because who has that kind of time in the morning? I even flossed, which I probably hadn't done in a week, because why not? Clara was out there having a complete meltdown, and I was in here practicing excellent oral hygiene. I caught my reflection in the mirror and had to admit, I looked pretty damn calm for a guy whose wife had just been caught red-handed, or should I say red-lipsticked, in what was definitely not a work emergency. My hair was a mess, sure, but there was something almost zen about my expression, like I'd achieved some kind of inner peace that only comes from finally stopping the denial and accepting reality for what it is. The doorbell was still going strong when I finally decided to put on a t-shirt. The one that said, "I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining why I'm right," which felt weirdly appropriate for the occasion. I took one last look in the mirror, nodded at myself like I was some kind of motivational speaker about to give the performance of a lifetime, and headed toward the front door with the casual energy of someone who was about to check if the pizza delivery guy had arrived, not confront his cheating wife. The knocking had evolved now into full-on pounding, the kind where you know someone's using both fists, and I could hear Clara's voice through the door, muffled but definitely frantic, yelling something about needing to explain. I stopped at the front door and looked through the peephole, because even in moments of marital destruction, home security is important, and what I saw was honestly better than any reality TV show I'd ever watched. There was Clara, and she looked absolutely wrecked. Her makeup, which had probably been perfectly applied earlier in the evening for her work dinner, was now smeared down her face like an abstract painting titled Bad Decisions. Her mascara had created these little black rivers down her cheeks, her lipstick, and yes, I noticed it was that expensive red shade she only wore for special occasions, was smudged across her face like she'd been making out with someone, which, let's be real, she definitely had been. Her hair, normally styled to perfection because Clara didn't do anything halfway, looked like she'd stuck her head out of a car window going 80 on the highway, all tangled and wild, and completely betraying whatever story she was about to try to sell me. I let her stew there for another 10 seconds, watching through the peephole as she went from pounding to pressing her face against the door, probably trying to hear if I was even home, which was hilarious, because where else would I be at almost 2:30 in the morning? Then I unlocked the deadbolt with the slowest, most deliberate motion I could manage, hearing it click in a way that made Clara immediately stop knocking and step back. I cracked the door open just enough to see her properly, but not enough for her to try to push her way in, because I'd seen enough movies to know that move was coming. "Please open the door, Henry. I can explain," she practically screamed, her voice doing that high-pitched, desperate thing that probably would have worked on me 6 months ago, but now just sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my expression as neutral as possible, and said, "Explain what? Why your work emergency required red lipstick and perfume that costs half my salary." I could smell it from where I was standing, that fancy designer perfume she'd bought last month and claimed was for boosting her confidence at work. Yeah, apparently her confidence needed boosting all the way into Richard's car or office, or wherever the hell they'd been. "It's not what you think," she stammered, and I had to physically stop myself from laughing because that exact line, has never in the history of caught cheaters ever been followed by anything good. "Oh really?" I said, letting the sarcasm drip from every word. "Because I think you won Employee of the Month in a very personal department, and I'm guessing the awards ceremony was very hands-on." Her eyes went wide, and she opened her mouth to respond, but I noticed something happening in my peripheral vision that made the whole situation even better. Lights were starting to come on in the neighbors' houses. First, it was old Mrs. Henderson across the street. That woman never missed any neighborhood drama. I swear she had some kind of gossip radar. Then the Johnsons' porch light flicked on next door, and I could see their curtains moving like they were settling in for the show. Even the Martinez family's upstairs window lit up, and I was pretty sure I saw their teenage son holding up his phone, probably recording this whole thing for TikTok or whatever the kids were using these days. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Let them all see the midnight soap opera. Let them watch Clara, the woman who was always so concerned about appearances and what the neighbors thought, have her complete breakdown on our front porch at 2:30 in the morning. The same woman who'd scolded me for leaving the garbage cans out too long because it looked tacky was now providing live entertainment for the entire street, while wearing the evidence of her affair like a scarlet letter made of smeared cosmetics. "Henry, please, can we talk inside?" Clara whispered urgently, finally noticing that we had acquired an audience. She kept trying to see past me into the house, like she thought she could just walk in and we'd have some quiet, rational conversation where she'd explain away everything and I'd nod and forgive her because that's what we were supposed to do after 8 years of marriage. "Nah, I'm good right here," I said, getting more comfortable against the doorframe. "Besides, I think the neighbors deserve some entertainment. Mrs. Henderson hasn't had this much excitement since her cat got stuck in a tree last summer." I was pretty sure I heard someone chuckle from one of the nearby houses, which just made the whole thing even more satisfying. Clara's face cycled through about 17 different emotions in 5 seconds. Embarrassment, anger, desperation, panic, and finally landing on what I can only describe as the realization that she had absolutely zero control over this situation. Her perfect little world, the one where she could have her stable marriage and her exciting affair, and keep both running smoothly without anyone finding out, had just exploded spectacularly in the most public way possible. And honestly, I was living for every second of it. "You're being ridiculous," she hissed, trying to keep her voice down now that she'd realized half the neighborhood was watching her personal disaster unfold in real time. "Ridiculous?" I repeated, raising my voice just enough that Mrs. Henderson could definitely hear me. "No. What's ridiculous is you thinking I'm stupid enough to believe whatever excuse you're about to make up on the spot." I paused for dramatic effect, because why not? "So go ahead, Clara. The stage is yours. Explain to me and everyone watching why you're coming home at 2:30 in the morning looking like you lost a fight with a makeup counter." The look on her face told me she was about to launch into her explanation, and I was absolutely ready for whatever ridiculous story she'd concocted during her panic drive home. This was going to be good. Clara took a deep breath, and I could literally see her brain working overtime trying to construct whatever fictional masterpiece she was about to present as the truth. Her eyes were darting around like she was reading invisible cue cards floating in the air, and I had to give her credit for one thing. She was really committed to this performance. Too bad I'd already seen the ending and knew it sucked. "My boss called about a deadline," she blurted out, and I swear I almost applauded right there because that was her opening statement. That was the best she could come up with after a 22-minute drive where she presumably had time to craft the perfect alibi. I'd seen better lies from politicians caught with offshore bank accounts. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider this absolutely groundbreaking explanation. "A deadline," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a bad smell. "At 2 a.m.? Clara, you're not a trauma surgeon saving lives. You're not a firefighter responding to emergencies. You sell office chairs. Office chairs. The kind of furniture that people sit on from 9 to 5 during business hours when deadlines are actually relevant." I paused, watching her face cycle through emotions like a slot machine. "So unless someone urgently needed a ergonomic lumbar support system delivered to their house in the middle of the night, I'm calling bullshit on that one." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she scrambled for version 2.0 of her terrible excuse. Mrs. Henderson's porch light was still on, across the street, and I was 99% sure I saw her standing at her window with binoculars, which was honestly the kind of energy I needed in my life right now. The woman was committed to her craft. "Okay, fine," Clara started, and I loved how she said it like she was doing me some huge favor by upgrading from one lie to a slightly different lie. His wife was sick, and he needed someone to talk to. It was an emotional emergency, Henry. I was being a good colleague, showing compassion during a difficult time. She actually put her hand over her heart when she said this, like she was some kind of humanitarian accepting an award for exceptional workplace empathy. I blinked at her. Once. Twice. Then I said, completely deadpan, "He's divorced." You know that sound that vinyl records make when someone scratches them? That screech noise? That's basically what happened in Clara's brain at that exact moment. Her entire face froze like someone had hit pause on a DVD player. Her hand was still over her heart in that fake compassionate gesture, but her eyes had gone completely blank, like her internal operating system had just crashed and was showing nothing but a blue screen of death. "What?" she whispered, and I could see the panic starting to really set in now because she'd just been caught in such an easily disprovable lie that even she couldn't figure out how to spin it. "Richard got divorced 6 months ago," I explained, speaking slowly like I was teaching a kindergarten class basic edition. "Remember? You told me about it. You came home all concerned about how he was handling the separation, how sad he seemed, how he was really struggling with being alone." I tapped my chin thoughtfully. "Actually, now that I think about it, that's right around when you started all these late-night work emergencies, isn't it? Funny how that timing works out." Clara looked like she was trying to mentally time travel back to 6 months ago to remember what lies she'd already told me so she could keep her story straight, but it was way too late for that. The ship had sailed, the train had left the station, and the horse had left the barn. Pick your metaphor, they all applied. She was drowning, and I was just standing there on the shore, refusing to throw her a life preserver. "I meant," she stammered, and I could see her eyes doing that thing again where they looked everywhere except at me, like the answer to her problems was written on our porch ceiling or hidden in the bushes. "His dog was sick." "Yeah, his dog. He has that golden retriever, remember? And she's old, and he thought she might not make it through the night, and he was really upset about it." I let that statement sit in the silence for a moment, just marinating in its own absurdity, while I contemplated whether my wife had actually just suggested that she stayed out until 2:30 in the morning to provide emotional support for a man whose hypothetical dog was hypothetically dying. The creativity was almost impressive if it wasn't so insulting to my intelligence. "Right?" I said, drawing out the word like it had about 15 extra syllables. "So you went to comfort the dog. That makes total sense. Tell me, did you bring flowers for the funeral? Or did you go with a nice chew toy as a get-well-soon gift? Maybe some of those fancy organic dog treats from that expensive pet store downtown?" I crossed my arms, really getting into the performance now. Clara's face went from pale to red so fast I was worried she might actually spontaneously combust right there on my porch, which would have been unfortunate because I'd just had the wood refinished last summer and bloodstains were probably not covered under warranty. She opened her mouth to respond, probably to dig herself even deeper into this hole she'd created, but I could see the exact moment when her brain just gave up entirely. Her eyes went kind of vacant, like a robot whose programming had encountered an error it couldn't resolve, and I swear I could almost hear the Windows shutdown noise playing in her head. "You're impossible," she finally cried, and I had to laugh because that was her defense now. I was impossible. I wasn't the one making up increasingly ridiculous stories about sick wives who weren't sick and weren't wives, and dying dogs that probably didn't exist, at 2:30 in the morning while covered in evidence of an affair. "No, just awake," I corrected her. "Very, very awake. And also not stupid, which seems to be a quality you were banking on me having tonight." That's when I noticed something that made this entire situation even better, if that was possible. Clara's car was sitting in the driveway, parked at this weird angle like she'd been in such a rush that she'd forgotten how parking worked. But here's the thing that made me pause. Her car was here, in our driveway. She hadn't even left the neighborhood, probably. If she'd actually been at the office with Richard like she'd claimed, or at his place comforting his sick fake wife or dying fake dog, she would have had to drive at least 20 minutes each way. But looking at her car, looking at the way she'd peeled into the driveway, looking at how fast she'd gotten here after my text, I did some quick mental math and realized something hilarious. "So tell me, Clara," I said, and I could feel the smile spreading across my face despite my best efforts to maintain my cool, detached demeanor. "Did your boss teleport you to the office? Because according to my very basic understanding of time and space, there's no way you could have been where you said you were and made it back here as fast as you did. Unless Richard has access to some kind of Star Trek transporter technology that I don't know about. In which case, honestly, I'm more impressed than angry." Her face did something I'd never seen before. It was like watching someone realize they'd just failed a test they thought they'd aced. Every muscle in her face seemed to be fighting against every other muscle, creating this expression that was part horror, part disbelief, and part resignation. She knew she was caught. Not just caught in a lie, but caught in a whole web of lies that were contradicting each other and falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. She started, But nothing came after that. Just I, hanging in the air like a lonely word that had lost all its friends. You what? I prompted, leaning forward slightly. You were actually parked 2 blocks away in the McDonald's parking lot making out with your boss in his car, like you're both 16 years old again? You were at that sketchy motel off Highway 9 that charges by the hour and has a sign that says clean rooms, which automatically means the rooms are definitely not clean? Where were you, Clara? Because it definitely wasn't where you said you were. And that's when the tears really started. Not the cute, delicate tears you see in movies where one single drop rolls down a perfectly made-up face. No, these were the ugly tears, the ones that come with snot and hiccuping and that weird gasping sound people make when they're trying to cry and breathe at the same time and failing at both. Her mascara, which had already been doing a pretty terrible job of staying where it was supposed to be, completely gave up and created these black streaks down her face that made her look like a sad raccoon who'd just been caught going through someone's garbage. I stood there watching this performance, and honestly, part of me was impressed by the commitment. If lying was an Olympic sport, Clara wouldn't win gold, but she'd definitely get points for artistic interpretation. If terrible excuses burned calories, she'd have abs that could cut diamonds by now. But mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the drama, tired of pretending that I hadn't known something was wrong for weeks now. Let's make this easy, I finally said. Clara was in full meltdown mode now, doing that thing where she was crying so hard that actual words were becoming difficult to form, and honestly, I'd had about enough of this outdoor theater production. We'd been standing at my doorway for what felt like an eternity, and I was getting tired of watching her try to juggle 17 different lies while simultaneously having an emotional breakdown. It was like watching someone try to play Jenga during an earthquake. Messy, chaotic, and destined to end badly. Let's make this easy, I said, cutting through her sobs like a knife through butter. Let's skip past all the creative fiction and the award-worthy acting and get to the part where you tell me the truth. I'm going to ask you one simple question, and I want one simple answer. No stories about sick wives, dying dogs, or emergency furniture deadlines. Just yes or no. Can you handle that? She looked up at me with those red, puffy eyes, mascara still making its tragic journey down her face, and nodded weakly like a bobblehead that had given up on life. I could see her trying to brace herself for whatever question was coming, probably running through a mental checklist of which lies she could still salvage and which ones were completely torched. Who is it? I asked, keeping my voice steady and calm, like I was asking her what she wanted for dinner and not who she'd been cheating on me with. She froze, completely froze, like someone had hit pause on her entire existence. Her mouth was slightly open, one hand still clutching the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright, and I watched as every possible response flickered across her face in real time. She was calculating whether she could still deny it, whether she could spin this into something less damaging, whether she could somehow make this my fault instead of hers. I'd been married to this woman for 8 years. I could read her like a book, and right now, that book was titled, "Oh shit, I'm caught and I don't know what to do." I was with someone, she finally whispered, and I had to resist the urge to slow clap because wow, what a confession. So Vega was basically useless, but I guess she thought that admitting to someone was somehow better than admitting to a specific person with a specific name who was specifically her married boss. The boss? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. But see, this was important. I needed to hear her say it. I needed her to actually admit it out loud instead of hiding behind pronouns and vague statements that could technically be interpreted multiple ways if you squinted hard enough. Clara's face went completely white, like someone had literally drained all the blood from her head. Her eyes got huge, and she looked at me like I'd just performed some kind of black magic mind-reading trick instead of just connecting the incredibly obvious dots that a golden retriever could have connected. How did you? She started, but the words died in her throat because she'd just confirmed it without actually meaning to confirm it. I smiled, and not a friendly smile either. This was the smile of someone who'd just won an argument before it even started. Lucky guess, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Also, I'm not blind. You've been dressing like LinkedIn Barbie for weeks now. New clothes, new hair, new perfume, suddenly caring about looking professional when you're literally selling chairs to people who don't care if you show up in a potato sack as long as the price is right. The dots weren't exactly hard to connect, Clara. They were practically drawing themselves. I thought about all those mornings over the past few weeks when she'd spend an extra hour getting ready for work, trying on 3 different outfits and asking me which one looked more professional, whatever that meant. I thought about how she'd started going to the gym at weird hours, how her phone had suddenly become this Fort Knox-level secure device that she never let out of her sight, how she'd developed this nervous habit of angling it away from me whenever a notification popped up. I thought about all the times she'd mentioned Richard's name in conversation, always with this weird emphasis, like she was testing how I'd react to hearing about him. The signs had been there the whole time. I'd just been choosing to ignore them because acknowledging them meant dealing with them, and dealing with them meant blowing up my entire life. She cried harder now, these big, heaving sobs that shook her whole body, and I wondered if she was crying because she felt genuinely guilty or because she'd gotten caught. There's a difference, you know. One is actual remorse about hurting someone you supposedly love, and the other is just being upset that your secret fun time had come to an end. Based on the way she kept glancing at her phone like she was hoping Richard would call with some magical solution to this disaster, I was betting on option 2. It wasn't planned. She managed to choke out between sobs, and I actually laughed out loud at that one. Couldn't help it. That line, "It wasn't planned," was right up there with "It just happened," and it didn't mean anything in the cheater's handbook of terrible excuses that nobody believes. "Oh yes," I said, really leaning into the sarcasm now because if I didn't laugh, I was probably going to punch a wall, and I'd already mentioned that I didn't want to punch walls. The classic, the printer jammed, and so did my moral story. I've heard that one before. It's a real page-turner. Let me guess how it goes. You were both working late, probably on some made-up project that definitely required you to be alone together after hours. And then there was this moment, this magical moment where you looked at each other, and suddenly 8 years of marriage just evaporated like morning dew. And before you knew it, whoops, you accidentally fell onto his dick. Multiple times. Over several weeks. What a tragic accident. Clara gasped like I'd just slapped her, which was rich considering she was the one who'd been conducting a full-blown affair, and I was just the guy pointing out the obvious. "Can you stop making jokes?" she asked, her voice going up about 3 octaves into that territory where dogs could probably hear it, but humans were struggling. "Not really," I admitted, shrugging. "Humor helps me not punch walls. And trust me, you want me making jokes right now because the alternative is significantly less pleasant for both of us." I leaned against the doorframe again, getting comfortable because this conversation was clearly going to last longer than I'd initially anticipated. "Besides, what do you want me to do? Cry? Beg you to stay? Fall on my knees and ask what I did wrong to drive you into the arms of Richard, the divorced office chair mogul with the overpriced cologne and the midlife crisis sports car?" I could see our other neighbors now. The Johnsons had actually come out onto their porch with what looked like popcorn, which was honestly the kind of commitment to neighborhood drama that I respected. Mr. Martinez was definitely recording this on his phone, probably already planning how to edit it for maximum viral potential. Mrs. Henderson had upgraded from binoculars to standing directly at her window, completely unashamed about her front row seat to the Henderson Street Theater production of Marriage Collapse, the musical. Clara noticed our audience too and tried to lower her voice, leaning in closer to the door like that would somehow make this conversation more private despite the fact that she'd been screaming and crying loud enough to wake up the entire zip code for the past 20 minutes. "Can we please talk about this inside?" she whispered desperately. "This is humiliating." "Oh, now it's humiliating?" I asked, raising my eyebrows. "It wasn't humiliating when you were sneaking around with your boss? It wasn't humiliating when you were lying to my face about work dinners and sick dogs? It wasn't humiliating when you sent me that text message with a typo because you were too busy doing God knows what to proofread? But now that people are watching, suddenly you're worried about being humiliated." I shook my head. "Sorry, Clara, but you don't get to control the narrative anymore. You lost that privilege when you decided to throw away our marriage for someone who probably still uses Internet Explorer." She reached out like she was going to grab my arm, do that thing where she touched me and looked into my eyes and tried to make me remember all the good times we'd had together, all the reasons I'd married her in the first place. But I stepped back before she could make contact, and I saw something break in her face when I did that. Like she'd just realized that maybe, just maybe, This wasn't something she could fix with tears and touching and empty promises. At least you picked someone with a decent salary, I continued, because apparently I wasn't done twisting the knife yet. Would have been embarrassing if it was the IT guy, Derek, with his Lord of the Rings lunchbox and his collection of anime figurines. At least Richard can probably afford to take you to restaurants that don't have a drive-through window. Though honestly, given the choice between someone who's passionate about programming and someone who's passionate about ergonomic office solutions, I might have gone with Derek. At least he has interesting hobbies. Her tears kicked into turbo mode, and I was genuinely starting to wonder if she was going to dehydrate herself right there on my porch. The crying had reached that level where it wasn't even producing sound anymore, just this weird gasping, hiccuping thing that made her whole body shudder. Part of me, a very small part that was buried under about 17 layers of anger and betrayal, felt bad for being so harsh. But then I remembered that she'd spent the last however many weeks lying to my face, and that small part of me shut up real quick. You don't understand, she managed to say through the sobs. It's complicated. No, it's really not, I said flatly. It's actually incredibly simple. You wanted to have an affair, so you had an affair. You wanted to feel desired and exciting and like you were the main character in some romantic drama instead of just a regular person in a regular marriage, so you went out and made that happen. The only complicated part is all the lying you had to do to keep it going, and honestly, you weren't even good at that part. I could tell she wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the ways it actually was complicated and how I just didn't understand what she was going through, but we both knew that anything she said at this point was just going to dig the hole deeper. She'd already confirmed the affair, already admitted to being with someone, already accidentally revealed it was Richard. The damage was done. The marriage was over. All that was left now was the cleanup. I'd had enough of standing at the doorway having this conversation that was going absolutely nowhere except in circles of tears and terrible excuses. My feet were getting cold on the hardwood floor. The neighbors had probably seen enough drama to last them through the next 5 homeowners association meetings, and honestly, I needed caffeine if I was going to continue dealing with this absolute dumpster fire of a situation. So I did what any reasonable person would do at almost 3 in the morning while their marriage imploded. I turned around and headed for the kitchen to make coffee. Where are you going? Clara called after me, her voice cracking with panic like I was abandoning her in the middle of a burning building instead of just walking away from my own front door in my own house. To make coffee. I called back over my shoulder, not even bothering to turn around. Because apparently I handle betrayal with caffeine and sarcasm, and I'm currently running low on one of those things. I heard her footsteps behind me, that distinct clicking sound her fancy heels made on the floor, the same heels she'd bought last month claiming they were on sale, but definitely weren't. The same heels she'd probably worn specifically for Richard because she knew they made her legs look good. Everything was starting to make sense now. All those little purchases and wardrobe upgrades that she'd explained away as treating herself or boosting her professional image. Yeah, professional. Right. She followed me into the kitchen, still crying, still looking like she'd been through an emotional blender set on the highest speed, and I ignored her while I went through the familiar ritual of making coffee. I pulled out my favorite mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Husband," which felt weirdly appropriate now, and started measuring out the grounds with the kind of precision usually reserved for bomb defusal. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and the smell started filling the kitchen, that rich, dark aroma that was basically the only thing keeping me from completely losing my mind right now. Clara stood there in the middle of my kitchen, wringing her hands like some kind of Victorian heroine from a tragic novel, and I could tell she was trying to figure out her next move. Should she keep crying? Should she try apologizing again? Should she attempt to explain herself more clearly? I could practically see the gears turning in her head, trying to calculate which approach would work best, which version of herself she should present to get the outcome she wanted. You can't just throw away 8 years, she finally blurted out. And there it was, the appeal to our history together, the classic move of someone who'd screwed up and was now trying to use time investment as leverage. Like our marriage was some kind of sunk cost fallacy that I had to honor because we'd already put in the work. I turned around slowly, leaning against the counter while the coffee maker did its thing behind me, and looked at her with the kind of expression you'd give someone who just claimed the earth was flat. Funny, I said, letting each word land with weight. You threw them first. In fact, You've probably been throwing them for weeks, maybe months, every single time you chose to lie to me. Every time you got dressed up for him. Every time you deleted a text message or angled your phone away from me like I was some kind of surveillance camera you needed to avoid. The coffee maker beeped, that cheerful little sound that meant my salvation was ready, and I turned to pour myself a cup, taking my time with it like I was some kind of coffee sommelier, and this was a tasting event. I added cream, stirred it slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl and lighten into that perfect caramel color. Clara was still standing there, watching me like she couldn't believe I was casually making coffee while our marriage burned down around us. But honestly, what did she expect? Did she think I'd collapse into a sobbing heap on the kitchen floor? That I'd beg her to explain everything and promise to forgive her if she just came clean? I took a sip, perfect temperature, perfect flavor, probably the best coffee I'd made in weeks, and pulled out my phone from my pocket. Clara's eyes widened when she saw it, probably thinking I was about to show her screenshots or evidence or something equally dramatic, but the truth was way better than that. By the way, I said casually, scrolling through my recent calls, that buzzing earlier? After I sent you that text? That wasn't all from you. I held up my phone so she could see the screen. See this call at 2:17? That's my lawyer. Jonathan. Nice guy, went to law school with my buddy Steve, specializes in divorce cases. He's meeting me at 9. Clara's face went through about 17 different shades of white and pale before settling on something that looked like absolute horror. You called a lawyer before talking to me? She whispered, and I had to appreciate the audacity of that statement, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by being prepared. Yep, I said, popping the P for emphasis and taking another sip of my excellent coffee. I called him right after you started blowing up my phone with all those panicked calls I didn't answer. Took me about 30 seconds to find his number and about 2 minutes to explain the situation. You know what he said? He said, "Good for you for not waiting." And then he told me to document everything and not let you back in the house. So technically, I'm already failing at following legal advice, but I figured I'd at least let you dig your own grave a little deeper before I completely shut the door on this whole situation. She looked like she was going to faint or throw up, or possibly both at the same time. Her hand reached out for the kitchen counter to steady herself, and I watched with a strange sense of detachment as she processed what I'd just told her. But we haven't even talked about this. We haven't tried to work it out. You can't just give up without even trying. Can't I, though? I asked, genuinely curious about her logic here. You called your boss before talking to me, remember? You made plans to meet up with him at whatever location you were at without consulting me. You decided to have an entire affair without including me in that decision-making process. So why exactly do I need to consult you before deciding that I'm done with this marriage? What? Do I need to file a formal request? Submit it in triplicate? Wait for approval from the Department of Broken Trust? Clara tried to grab my arm, reaching out with that desperate energy of someone who'd just realized they'd lost control of the entire situation. Please, Henry, you're not thinking straight. You're angry and you're hurt, and you're not making rational decisions right now. I stepped back before she could touch me, again, because I was not about to let her use physical contact as some kind of emotional manipulation tactic. No, Clara, I'm thinking perfectly straight for the first time in months. You know when I wasn't thinking straight? When I ignored all those red flags. When I pretended not to notice that you were pulling away. When I convinced myself that you were just stressed from work and that everything was fine. That's when I wasn't thinking straight. Right now? Right now I'm thinking with crystal clarity. And that clarity is telling me that I deserve better than someone who lies to my face and then expects me to stick around for the apology tour. She was full-on sobbing again, that ugly crying that comes with snot and hiccups and gasping breaths. And normally, in any other situation, I would have felt bad. I would have offered her a tissue, maybe a glass of water, some kind of comfort. But standing there in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, drinking my perfectly made coffee while she cried about consequences she'd brought on herself, I just felt tired. Not angry anymore, not even particularly hurt, just exhausted by the entire situation. You don't understand how hard this has been for me, she managed to say through the tears, and wow, that was bold. That was impressively bold. She was really going to try to make herself the victim here? Hard for you, I repeated, my voice going dangerously quiet. Let me tell you what's been hard. Hard has been lying in bed every night wondering why my wife doesn't want to touch me anymore. Hard has been watching you get excited about going to work and realizing you've never been that excited about coming home. Hard has been pretending everything is fine while you slowly checked out of this marriage one lie at a time. So forgive me if I don't have a lot of sympathy for how hard it's been for you to juggle a husband and a boyfriend simultaneously. I finished my coffee, still the best cup I'd made in weeks. Honestly, this whole crisis was really bringing out my barista skills, and rinsed the mug in the sink, taking my time with it because I knew it was driving Clara crazy that I was being so calm and methodical about everything. She wanted drama, wanted big emotional reactions, wanted me to either explode in anger or collapse in grief so she could know how to respond. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. So here's how this is going to work, I said, drying my hands on a dish towel and turning to face her with the kind of composure I didn't actually feel but was faking really well. You're going to leave. You're going to go stay with your mom, or your sister, or hell, go stay with Richard for all I care. I'm sure he's got plenty of room now that he's divorced. And I'm going to meet with Jonathan at 9 o'clock, and we're going to start the paperwork to end this marriage as quickly and cleanly as possible. You'll get your stuff, I'll get mine. We'll divide everything like adults, and then we can both move on with our lives. I don't want a divorce, she whispered, and I almost laughed at how absurd that statement was coming from someone who'd literally been cheating on me. Well, I didn't want a cheating wife, but we don't always get what we want, do we? I said, life's funny that way, full of little disappointments and betrayals and moments where you realize that the person you married isn't actually the person standing in front of you anymore. I sipped my coffee dramatically. Okay, it was actually just water at this point since I'd already finished the coffee, but I'd refilled the mug and the dramatic sipping motion still worked, while she sobbed like a malfunctioning sprinkler system that someone had set to the highest pressure setting. The sound was honestly impressive in its intensity, like she was trying to cry out enough tears to fill a small pool, and I wondered briefly if this was genuine emotion or just another performance designed to manipulate me into changing my mind. Either way, it wasn't working. My mind was made up. Jonathan was already aware of the situation and preparing whatever paperwork needed to be prepared, and I was done. Completely, totally, exhaustively done with this entire situation. All I wanted now was for Clara to leave so I could finally get some sleep in my own house without wondering where my wife was, or who she was with, or what lies she was telling. I thought the drama had peaked. I really did. I genuinely believed that we'd hit maximum chaos levels for one night, and that things couldn't possibly get more ridiculous. But then again, I'd also believed my wife was working late and not conducting an affair with her divorced boss. So clearly my judgment about what could and couldn't happen was completely shot. It was around 5 a.m. Yes, we'd been at this for almost 3 hours now, which should tell you everything you need to know about how this night was going. When my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately and dreaded deeply. Margaret, Clara's mother, calling from whatever time zone she was currently residing in with the kind of timing that suggested Clara had absolutely called her the second she'd gotten a moment alone. I stared at the phone for a solid 5 seconds, watching Margaret's name flash on the screen like a warning beacon, and seriously considered not answering. But then I thought, you know what? Why not? Let's make this a full family affair. Let's get everyone involved in this spectacular implosion of my marriage. Maybe we could sell tickets, make it a whole event, get some sponsors involved. The neighbors were already invested. Might as well bring in the extended family too. I hit the answer button and barely got the phone to my ear before Margaret's voice came through. And let me tell you, she did not sound happy. Henry, what is going on? Clara just called me absolutely hysterical, saying you locked her out of the house and won't talk to her. Her voice had that sharp, accusatory edge that mothers get when they think someone has wronged their child, and I could already tell this conversation was going to be a ride. I glanced over at Clara, who was sitting at my kitchen table now, still crying, but in a more subdued way, like she'd finally hit the limit of how many tears a human body could physically produce in one night. She was staring at her phone, probably waiting for her mother to call back with news that she'd successfully guilt-tripped me into taking her back. Poor Clara. She really didn't know her mother as well as she thought she did. Did she also mention the part where she's been having an affair with her boss? I asked, keeping my voice pleasant and conversational, like I was discussing the weather or weekend plans instead of infidelity. Or did she leave that detail out of her hysterical phone call? The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that I actually checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. But no, Margaret was still there, just processing what I'd just told her with what I imagined was the same expression someone would have if you told them their dog had learned to speak French. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she said in a very different tone, "What?" "Yeah," I continued, walking out of the kitchen and into the living room so I could have this conversation without Clara staring at me like a sad puppy. Turns out those work dinners she's been going to, not actually work dinners, more like romantic dinners, with her married boss. Except he's divorced, so I guess technically it's romantic dinners with her divorced boss, which somehow doesn't make it better even though Clara seemed to think mentioning his marital status would help her case. "Clara." Margaret's voice went sharp enough to cut glass. "Is this true?" I could hear Clara's response from the kitchen. That small, pathetic, "It was a mistake," that she'd been recycling all night like it was going to suddenly become more effective through repetition. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Margaret's voice came back on the line, and now she sounded less like an angry mother defending her child, and more like an angry mother who'd just discovered her child had done something monumentally stupid. "Henry, I am so sorry. I had no idea. When did this start? How long has this been going on?" "Honestly, Margaret, your guess is as good as mine," I said, settling onto my couch with the kind of exhaustion that comes from being awake for over 24 hours and dealing with emotional chaos for 3 of them. Based on the timeline I've pieced together from her increasingly terrible lies, I'm guessing at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. Could be months for all I know. She's not exactly being forthcoming with details, and frankly, I don't really care anymore. The when doesn't matter as much as the fact that it happened at all. 6 weeks. Margaret's voice went up about 3 octaves, and I heard some rustling on her end like she was getting out of bed, which she probably was since it was stupid early in the morning. "Clara Marie Henderson, you have been lying to your husband for 6 weeks. Clara's full name. Oh man, she was in trouble now. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered the whole cheating thing, and the feeling passed pretty quickly. "It wasn't planned, Mom." Clara called out from the kitchen, and I had to hand it to her. She was really committed to that line. If they gave out awards for most consistently used terrible excuse, she'd be a shoo-in for the trophy. "Apparently it just happened," I added helpfully into the phone. "You know, like how rain just happens, or traffic jams just happen, or how you just accidentally trip and fall into an affair with your boss that lasts for weeks and involves elaborate lies about work emergencies and sick dogs that don't exist. Classic case of things just happening beyond anyone's control." Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a growl. "Henry, I don't even know what to say. I raised her better than this. I know I raised her better than this." "You did," I assured her, and I meant it. Margaret wasn't a bad person, and she'd actually been a pretty decent mother-in-law over the years. She baked cookies for every holiday, remembered my birthday, never did that passive-aggressive thing where she criticized Clara through complimenting me. She was genuinely one of the good ones. This isn't on you. Clara's an adult who made adult decisions, and now she gets to deal with adult consequences. That's how life works. "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked, and I could hear the resignation in her voice, like she already knew the answer but had to ask anyway. "I've already called my lawyer," I said flatly. "We're meeting at 9. I'm filing for divorce as soon as humanly possible because I'm not interested in dragging this out or trying to work through it, or whatever people are supposed to do when they find out their spouse has been cheating on them. Clara made her choice, and now I'm making mine." "Good," Margaret said, and I actually had to pull the phone away from my ear to make sure I'd heard her correctly. Did my mother-in-law just say good? To me divorcing her daughter? "I'm sorry, Henry. You deserve better than this. You've always been good to her, always treated her well, and this is how she repays you? By sneaking around with her boss like some kind of..." She cut herself off, probably remembering that Clara was still her daughter despite being a terrible wife. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, genuinely touched by her response. "That actually means a lot. I was kind of expecting you to defend her, or try to convince me to give her another chance, or do the whole marriage is sacred speech." "Oh, marriage is sacred," Margaret said firmly, which is exactly why what she did is so unforgivable. You don't treat sacred things like garbage and then expect them to still work. She broke something that can't be fixed with apologies and tears, and she needs to understand that. "Clara, are you listening to me?" I heard Clara's muffled, "Yes, Mom," from the kitchen, and I could picture her sitting there, probably feeling like she was 12 years old again and getting lectured for breaking curfew. Except this time the consequences were slightly more severe than losing her allowance. "I want you to go to your sister's house," Margaret continued, her voice taking on that commanding tone that mothers perfect over decades of dealing with children who don't want to do what they're told. "Right now? Tonight? This morning? Whatever time it is there. You're going to pack a bag. You're going to leave Henry alone, and you're going to give him the space he clearly needs and deserves. And then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about why you thought destroying your marriage was a good idea." "But Mom," Clara started, but Margaret cut her off faster than a knife through butter. "No buts. You don't get to, but you're way out of this one. You made your bed, now you get to lie in it. Or rather, you get to lie in your sister's guest room while you figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life now that you've blown up your marriage for someone who probably isn't even going to stay with you once he realizes you're available and the excitement of sneaking around is gone." Damn, Margaret was absolutely destroying Clara right now, and I was here for every second of it. I'd always liked my mother-in-law, but I was loving her right now. She was saying all the things I'd been thinking but hadn't quite articulated because I was too busy being sarcastic and making coffee. "Margaret, I have to say," I interjected, unable to help myself, "thank you for raising a woman who at least feels guilt on command. That's something, I guess. Not enough to save the marriage, but it's a quality that exists." Margaret actually laughed, though it was one of those bitter laughs that people do when something is more sad than funny. "Henry, you're a better man than she deserves. You've always been too good for her. I just didn't realize how true that was until right now." "I appreciate that," I said sincerely. "And I appreciate you not doing the thing where you try to defend her or make excuses or blame me for somehow driving her into another man's arms. That's refreshingly honest." "There's no excuse for cheating," Margaret said firmly. "None. I don't care if you'd been the worst husband in the world, which you weren't. She should have either tried to fix things or left you before starting something with someone else. That's what adults do. That's what people with integrity do. This sneaking around, this lying, this betraying someone who trusted you, that's coward behavior, and I didn't raise a coward." I could hear Clara crying again in the kitchen, harder now, probably because having your own mother's side with your soon-to-be ex-husband was hitting differently than having your husband be angry at you. There was something about parental disappointment that cut deeper than almost anything else, and right now, Margaret was serving it up with the efficiency of someone who'd been perfecting the art of maternal disappointment for decades. "She's going to call you back," Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. "After she calms down, she's going to try to apologize and explain and make you understand why she did what she did. Don't answer if you don't want to. You don't owe her anything at this point." "I wasn't planning on it," I assured her. "My lawyer already advised me to limit contact, and honestly, I've heard enough lies and excuses tonight to last me a lifetime. Whatever she has to say, she can say it through her lawyer once she gets one." When we hung up a few minutes later, after Margaret had given me her personal number and told me to call her if I needed anything or if Clara tried to harass me, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not just relief that someone was on my side, but relief that I wasn't crazy for thinking this was unforgivable. By the time sunrise rolled around, and yes, I'd been awake for the entire night at this point, running on nothing but coffee, spite, and the righteous indignation of a man who'd been wronged, my front yard had transformed into something that looked less like a peaceful suburban property and more like the staging area for a low-budget reality TV show about family dysfunction. I'm talking cars parked at weird angles all over the street, people I was related to by marriage standing on my lawn looking concerned and confused, and enough dramatic tension in the air to power a small city. It was like someone had sent out an emergency broadcast saying, "Family crisis at Henry's house. All available relatives please report immediately." And everyone had actually shown up. Clara's parents were there, obviously. Margaret looking exhausted but determined, and her dad Robert looking like he wished he was literally anywhere else on planet Earth. Clara's sister Lydia had shown up with her husband Mark, both of them looking like they'd gotten dressed in about 30 seconds and hadn't bothered to check if their clothes matched. And then, because apparently this situation wasn't chaotic enough already, there was Uncle Ray, the forever divorced uncle who showed up to every family gathering with unsolicited advice about relationships despite having failed at every single one of his own. Ray was that relative, you know, the one, who thought his 3 divorces made him an expert on marriage instead of a cautionary tale about making terrible life choices repeatedly. I opened my front door to this absolute circus of concerned family members, and honestly, part of me wanted to just close it again and pretend none of this was happening. But the other part of me, the part that was running on fumes and had completely run out of patience for pretending everything was fine, figured why not let this play out? It was already the worst night of my life. Might as well make it a group activity. Morning, everyone, I said, leaning against my doorframe with the casual energy of someone who is absolutely dead inside but too stubborn to show it. Welcome to the Henry and Clara Show, season finale, The Affair Revelation. Please keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times, and remember, there's no refunds on emotional damage. Uncle Ray decided to start things off, because of course he did, stepping forward with that self-important energy that only men who think they're wise despite all evidence to the contrary can pull off. Marriage takes work, Henry, he began, and I had to physically stop myself from laughing in his face because this man, this thrice-divorced man who currently lived alone in a studio apartment with a cat who barely tolerated him, was about to lecture me about making marriage work. Yeah, Ray, I said, cutting him off before he could really get going on whatever speech he'd prepared during his drive over. You're absolutely right. Marriage takes work. But the kind of work marriage needs is stuff like communication and compromise, and maybe couples therapy if things get really rough. Not the kind you do at 2 a.m. with your boss in what I'm assuming was either his car or a cheap motel. That's a different kind of work entirely. And it's not the kind that helps a marriage, it's the kind that ends one. Mark, Lydia's husband, and honestly one of the few people in Clara's family I actually liked, made this choking sound like he was trying not to laugh, covering his mouth with his hand and turning away slightly. I caught his eye, and he gave me this subtle nod that said, "Damn, dude, well played," and I appreciated that more than he probably realized in that moment. Lydia folded her arms, her expression shifting from concerned to absolutely pissed in about half a second. She cheated, Uncle Ray. Stop defending stupidity. And that was why I liked Lydia. She didn't sugarcoat things or try to make excuses for bad behavior just because it came from family. She called it like she saw it, and right now, she was seeing her sister very clearly for the first time. Uncle Ray looked like he'd been slapped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish that had suddenly found itself out of water, trying to come up with some response that would re-establish his authority as the family relationship expert. But before he could formulate whatever nonsense he was planning to say, Mark decided to twist the knife a little deeper. Guess the promotion wasn't the only thing on the table, Mark muttered under his breath, but loud enough that everyone heard it, and I swear to God, even Margaret, who'd been looking generally stern and disappointed, had to turn away to hide what might have been a smile, trying to break through her serious expression. The silence that followed was absolutely golden. That perfect, awkward silence where everyone knows someone just said something savage, but nobody's quite sure if they should acknowledge it or pretend they didn't hear. Clara, who'd been standing off to the side looking like she wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole, turned an even deeper shade of red than I thought was physically possible. Her face went from regular embarrassed pink to full-on fire engine red, and I wondered briefly if she was going to pass out from the sheer humiliation of having her affair discussed in front of her entire family at sunrise in my front yard. "Can we not?" Clara started, her voice small and defeated. But Lydia cut her off with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting years to tell her sister exactly what she thought of her life choices. Not what? Not talk about the fact that you destroyed your marriage? Not mention that you've been lying to everyone for weeks? Not acknowledge that you threw away a good man for someone who probably still thinks Axe body spray is cologne? Lydia was on a roll now, and I was absolutely here for it. I told you that Richard gave off creeper vibes when you first started working there. I told you he was bad news. But you didn't listen because you were too busy being flattered by the attention. He's not a bad man, Clara said quietly, and the moment those words left her mouth, I knew. I just knew that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. You could physically feel the energy in the yard shift, like someone had just flipped a switch that said, "Oh, it's over now." The room, or yard, I guess, since we were outside, froze. And I mean completely froze, like someone had hit pause on reality itself. Margaret's eyes went wide. Robert's face turned red. Lydia's jaw literally dropped open. Mark stopped mid-chuckle. Even Uncle Ray, who'd been trying to formulate some wisdom about forgiveness or second chances or whatever divorced uncles talk about, went completely silent. "Oh, so you're defending your lover now?" I asked, and my voice was so calm, so perfectly level, that it was actually more terrifying than if I'd yelled. "That's the play we're going with here? We're at the 'but he's actually a really good guy once you get to know him' stage of this disaster? Clara, read the room. Actually, read the yard. Look around at the faces of everyone who drove over here at dawn because they thought you needed support, and tell me if you think defending Richard is really the move right now." Mark couldn't help himself. "Damn, she's still digging," he muttered to Lydia, who was staring at her sister like she'd never seen her before, like Clara had suddenly revealed herself to be an alien wearing a human suit and doing a terrible job of pretending to understand normal human behavior. Even Uncle Ray, the man who'd shown up ready to deliver a speech about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of forgiveness despite having 0 successful marriages in his own history, whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're on your own, kid." And that's when I knew I'd won. Not that this was ever really a competition, but in that moment, watching Clara's own family turn on her one by one as they realized she was still defending the guy she'd cheated with instead of showing any real remorse for what she'd done, I realized that I had the moral high ground, the legal high ground, and the family support high ground. I had all the high grounds. I was standing on top of High Ground Mountain, looking down at Clara in the Valley of Terrible Decisions. Robert, who'd been silent this entire time, finally spoke up. "Clara, honey, I think you should stop talking now." His voice was gentle but firm, the way fathers talk when they're trying to save their children from themselves. "Every word that comes out of your mouth is making this worse." "I just meant," Clara tried again, but Margaret cut her off with a hand gesture that had probably been perfected over 3 decades of parenting. "We know what you meant," Margaret said coldly. "You meant that you've developed feelings for this man, which means this wasn't just a physical affair, it was an emotional one too, which somehow makes it worse, if that's even possible at this point." Lydia turned to me, and her expression was genuinely apologetic. "Henry, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened to her. This isn't the sister I grew up with. The Clara I knew would never." She stopped, shaking her head. "I'm just sorry. You deserved better than this." "Thanks, Lydia," I said, and I meant it. It was weirdly comforting to know that at least some of Clara's family was on my side, or at least on the side of basic human decency and not cheating on your spouse. Mark stepped forward, clapping me on the shoulder in that way guys do when they don't really know what to say, but want to show support anyway. "You need anything, man, place to crash, someone to help you move stuff, back up at the lawyer's office, just call." "Seriously, I appreciate that," I said, and I did. Mark was good people. Always had been. I made a mental note that in the divorce, I was keeping Mark and Lydia as friends. Clara could have Uncle Ray and his terrible advice. The sun was fully up now, bathing my disaster of a front yard in golden morning light that made everything look way more peaceful than it actually was. Mrs. Henderson was still at her window. I had to give her credit for commitment. And I was pretty sure she was taking notes at this point, probably planning to write a memoir about the most dramatic night in neighborhood history. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, addressing the group like I was leading a board meeting instead of managing a family crisis. "Clara is going to pack her essentials, and I mean essentials, not half the house. And she's going to stay with either you, Margaret, or you, Lydia, whoever volunteers as tribute. I have a meeting with my lawyer in, I checked my phone, about 3.5 hours, and I'd really like to get a shower and maybe 45 minutes of sleep before I have to deal with paperwork." Any objections? Nobody objected. Even Clara seemed to realize that she'd lost this battle, this war, and probably the next 3 wars after this one. She nodded weakly, looking like she'd aged about 10 years overnight, and started heading toward the house to pack. Watching Clara pack her things was surreal in a way I hadn't expected. This woman who'd shared my life for 8 years was now moving through our bedroom like a stranger, pulling clothes from drawers and hangers with shaking hands while her mother supervised from the doorway, like a prison guard, making sure an inmate didn't try to steal anything on their way out. The whole scene had this weird finality to it, like watching the end credits roll on a movie you'd invested way too much time in only to discover the ending sucked. "Can I at least pack some things?" Clara had asked earlier, her voice small and defeated, and honestly, I'd almost felt bad for her in that moment. Almost. But then I remembered the lipstick and the lies and the 2:30 in the morning text message, and the sympathy evaporated faster than water on hot pavement. Of course, I'd said, gesturing toward the bedroom like a hotel concierge showing a guest to their room. Take whatever you need, just not my sanity. That's the one thing you don't get to pack in your suitcase and take with you. She tried to hug me then, actually reached out with both arms like we were saying goodbye after a normal visit and not ending our entire marriage, and I stepped back so fast I almost tripped over the coffee table. The look on her face when I avoided her touch was something between hurt and shock, like she genuinely couldn't believe I didn't want her anywhere near me after everything that had happened. Save the affection for your performance reviews, I said, and I heard Mark snort from the living room where he and Lydia were pretending not to listen to every word of this conversation. Now, 45 minutes later, Clara had managed to pack 2 suitcases and a duffel bag with Margaret's help, and honestly, I was impressed by the efficiency. Margaret had clearly taken over the operation, making executive decisions about what was essential and what could be retrieved later, probably because she knew that if she left Clara to her own devices, we'd be here until next Tuesday, while Clara had an emotional breakdown over every item she touched. Lydia had been muttering commentary the entire time from her position in the hallway, little observations like, "You won't need those heels where you're going," and "Pretty sure Henry paid for that dress, maybe leave it," which wasn't technically helpful but was definitely entertaining. Her sister had zero chill, and I respected that about her immensely. When Clara finally emerged from the bedroom, looking like she'd been through an actual war instead of just packing some clothes, she stopped in front of me one last time. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her makeup was completely destroyed, and she had that desperate look that people get when they're trying to figure out if there's any possible way to undo what they've done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and it was probably the most genuine thing she'd said all night. Not the most useful thing, not the thing that would change anything, but at least it sounded like she meant it. I nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact because I wanted her to see that I was completely serious about what I was about to say. Apology accepted. Marriage revoked. It was clean. Simple. Final. 6 words that ended 8 years of history, and honestly, they felt right. No dramatic speeches, no crying, no last-minute pleas for reconciliation. Just a simple acknowledgement that yes, she was sorry, and yes, it was over anyway. Clara opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else. Probably another apology or an explanation or a plea for me to reconsider. But Margaret put a hand on her shoulder and shook her head. Smart woman, Margaret. She knew when a conversation was over, even if her daughter didn't. They filed out of the house one by one. Margaret first with one of the suitcases, then Lydia with the duffel bag, then Clara with the remaining suitcase, looking back over her shoulder every few steps like she expected me to call her back and tell her this was all some kind of test or joke or elaborate prank. Robert followed behind them all, giving me a nod that said more than words could have, and then Mark, who clapped me on the shoulder one more time and said, "You're gonna be fine, man. Better than fine, actually." The door shut behind them with a soft click that sounded way louder than it should have, and suddenly the house was quiet. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when something major ends and you're left standing in the aftermath, trying to figure out what just happened. I stood there in my entryway for a solid minute, just listening to the nothing, feeling the emptiness of a house that had held 2 people for years suddenly adjusting to holding just one. I walked to the window and watched them load Clara's stuff into Margaret's car, watched Clara get into the back seat like a kid being picked up from a sleepover that had gone badly, watched the car pull away from my curb and disappear around the corner. And when they were gone, really, truly gone, I felt it. Peace. Actual, genuine peace. The kind I hadn't felt in months, maybe longer. The faint smell of freedom hung in the air, mixing with the lingering scent of coffee from earlier, and I realized something important. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. 3 months later, Karma decided to stop taking its sweet time and finally showed up to work. And let me tell you, when Karma clocks in, it doesn't mess around with subtle life lessons or gentle course corrections. No. Karma went straight for the jugular with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for the perfect moment to absolutely demolish some lives. And I was absolutely here for every single delicious second of it. I found out about the whole thing from Mark, actually, who'd heard it from Lydia, who'd heard it from their cousin Jessica, who worked in the same office building as Clara and had front row seats to the absolute dumpster fire that Clara's professional life had become. Apparently, and this is where it gets really good, Richard, the boss, the divorced guy with the allegedly sick dog, the man who Clara had defended as not a bad man, got fired. Not just fired, but spectacularly, publicly, humiliatingly fired for creating a hostile work environment. Here's the thing though, Richard's wife, the one who Clara claimed was sick except she wasn't actually his wife anymore, turned out to be not quite as ex as everyone thought. Sure, they were divorced on paper, but apparently they'd been trying to work things out, going to couples therapy, the whole 9 yards. And Richard had conveniently forgotten to mention this little detail to Clara during their romantic rendezvous. So when the wife, let's call her Jennifer because that was actually her name, found out about the affair, she didn't just get mad. She got evidence. Jennifer had screenshots, text messages, emails, calendar invites that were definitely not about actual work meetings, expense reports for hotel rooms that Richard had claimed were for client entertainment. She had everything, all compiled into a beautiful folder of receipts that she hand-delivered to HR with the kind of professional thoroughness that suggested she'd been planning this revenge for a while and was savoring every moment of it. HR took one look at that folder and apparently Richard was escorted out of the building within the hour, his office packed up by security while everyone watched. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. But wait, it gets better. Clara didn't get fired, which honestly might have been more merciful, but she got reassigned. They moved her from her nice office with the window view to a basement desk next to the server room that made this constant humming noise. Her new job responsibilities included refilling printer paper, organizing supply closets, and updating spreadsheets that nobody actually read. Basically, they demoted her to a position that didn't technically exist before they created it specifically to punish her without actually firing her. And the nickname? Oh man, the nickname was just Chef's Kiss Perfect. According to Jessica, Clara's co-workers had started calling her 2 a.m. Clara because apparently word had spread about the circumstances of her affair coming to light. Nothing stays secret in an office environment, especially when the affair involves the boss and ends with him getting publicly fired. People talked, rumors flew, and somehow the detail about the 2:30 in the morning text message had made it into the office gossip circuit. I heard she couldn't walk through the office without people whispering and smirking, couldn't eat lunch in the break room without conversation stopping when she walked in. It was brutal, but also, and I say this with zero guilt, completely deserved. She'd made her choices, and now she got to live with the consequences in the form of eternal office humiliation and a job that made filing papers seem exciting by comparison. The best part? Clara texted me about a month into her new reality. Just one message that appeared on my phone like a ghost from a past life I'd successfully moved on from. I'm in therapy now. I've learned from my mistakes. I stared at that message for about 5 seconds, watching the little dots appear and disappear as she presumably wrote and deleted follow-up messages, trying to figure out what else to say that wouldn't make things worse. Part of me wanted to respond with something cutting, something sarcastic that would let her know exactly how little I cared about her personal growth journey. But then I realized something better. Silence was way more powerful than any response I could craft. I replied with nothing. Didn't even leave her on read. Just never opened the message at all. Let her see that little delivered notification and wonder forever if I'd even bothered to look at it. Let her sit with the uncertainty of not knowing if I'd forgiven her, still hated her, or had simply moved on so completely that she didn't even register as important enough to acknowledge. Silence became my favorite language, especially when it came to Clara. By now, I'd completely turned my life around, and I don't mean that in some vague, inspirational poster kind of way. I mean, I'd literally replaced everything that reminded me of Clara. New couch because the old one had too many memories of us watching terrible reality TV together. New bedding because sleeping on the same sheets felt weird. New routine that involved actually going to the gym instead of just thinking about it. My house felt like mine again, not ours, and that difference was more significant than I'd expected. My neighbor Paul stopped by one Saturday afternoon, looking relieved to escape his own house. Lunch. My wife's out of town visiting her sister, and I'm tired of pretending I know how to cook anything that doesn't come with instructions that say microwave for 3 minutes. We hit this burger place downtown that had been there forever, The kind of place with checkered floors and waitresses who called everyone Han and didn't judge you for ordering fries and onion rings. Paul asked the question everyone had been dancing around for months. So, any regrets? I took a bite of my burger, perfectly cooked, extra pickles, the exact kind of simple pleasure I'd been enjoying more lately, and thought about it. Did I regret how I'd handled things? The sarcasm, the cold efficiency, the way I'd shut Clara out completely? Only that I didn't block her sooner, I said, and I meant it. Paul laughed so hard, he almost choked on his drink. You handled that like a legend, man. Seriously, everyone's been talking about it. You're like the neighborhood hero for standing up for yourself. Later that evening, I was grilling on my patio when Margaret called, which surprised me because we hadn't talked much since the divorce was finalized. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice soft. You handled everything with grace. Grace? Margaret, I handled it with sarcasm and good coffee, but close enough. I replied, flipping a burger with probably more confidence than the situation required. She laughed, really laughed, and it was nice to hear. You deserve better, Henry. You always did. When we hung up, I looked around at my quiet yard, at the grill I'd bought myself last month, at the peace I'd built from the wreckage of my marriage. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I was truly content. No drama, no lies, no wondering where my wife was or who she was with. That one text, no need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now, wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of my peace. The beginning of a life where I didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, where I could just be myself without worrying about someone else's lies catching up to me. And honestly, I'd never slept better. My bed was mine, my house was mine, my life was mine. And that was worth more than any marriage built on lies could ever be.